rusty script. Her coat was wrapped as tightly around her as the fraying fabric allowed, but still the winter air dug through it. The cold was not enough, however, to drive her out of the elements and through the door. Once or twice she approached it, hand shaking as it neared the handle, only to draw back at the last second, as if the handle were a snake. It should have been easier to enter the door the longer she waited, but it seemed to only grow immeasurably more difficult. It did not help that in her entire time waiting, no one had entered or left the building. Had someone sallied up, opened the door, and safely entered into a cloud of inviting warmth, it may have lured her in. Similarly, the safe exit of any sort of person would have given her the assurance that one could brave whatever lay beyond. But the road was empty, and the door sat unmoving. A particularly sharp gust of wind whistled down the abandoned alley, tugging at her coat and sending her tangled hair into a maelstrom. Her eyes watered at the cold, and she inched closer to the wall, hoping it would afford some protection. It was silly, she chided herself, spending all this time out in the elements. This was what had to be done. She was out of options, and her only hope lay beyond that door. Yet Marjorie wondered if perhaps it was better to be hopeless than pay whatever price this hope would cost. The street light flickered on overhead. Soon it would be dark, and then she would have to make a decision or risk staying on the unsafe streets at night. Being here in the middle of the day was dangerous enough. She would not be caught outside after dark. That was the final shove she needed to overcome her inertia. With sudden resolve, she gripped the door handle. It flew open in her hands almost reflexively, for which she was glad. The metal was bitterly cold, seeming almost to burn her with its chill. Had the door not stood open, she would have again released it and likely vanished back to her home. Inside was a nondescript concrete hallway. A lonely yellow light filled the inside, leading to another door. This door was made of a dark wood and had a heavy brass knocker affixed to the middle. Marjorie's steps echoed in the concrete chamber, coming to a sudden stop when the metal door groaned to a loud close. The weak evening light was now gone, leaving her alone with only the single bulb. She had not realized how comforting it was to have that little bit of the outside world with her. With the door closed, even the distant sounds of traffic were cut off. Panic wrapped its claws around her throat. She felt her chest tighten with its serpentine grip. Her heart thundered against her ribs. In that moment, instincts took over, and she reverted to her most primitive response: flee. The echoes of her steps were a maddening flurry around her as she sprinted the 15 back to the metal door. Her hands scrambled for purchase on the handle, only to find nothing but smooth metal. No handle on this side. The thunder of thousands of years of evolution continued to push her towards flight, and her fingers clawed around the metal door frame, hoping to find some crevice to pry open the door. Only there was again nothing, place despite her insistence. Over time, however, she won out. The breaths were shaky but calm, and her heart took its cue to return to its typical state of frenzy. The walls returned to their assigned places and stopped their dizzying journey. Carefully, Marjorie ran her hands along the wall where the door stood, confirming that there was no seam that she could grip. It was a well-constructed door. There was not even a glimmer of dying afternoon light slipping through the bottom. If she could not back out now, she must go forward. The hallway was not long, but she felt like a member of a funeral procession as she somberly made her way towards the door. Up close, she could see twisting, abstract shapes carved all over the door. They meant nothing to her, but she felt her breaths begin to hiccup again in her chest. Deep breaths, she repeated her only mantra. Her hand was shaking as she placed it on the brass knocker. Unlike the door handle, this one was pleasantly warm to the touch, inviting almost. With a groan of rusted metal, she lifted it and rapped it quickly against the door. 1, 2, 3. The door began to swing smoothly on its hinges after the third knock, opening on to a room filled with the murmur of quieted voices and wisps of strange-smelling smoke. She stepped gingerly inside, feeling immediately out of place. There were tables and booths scattered around the room. Marjorie did her best not to make eye contact or even look at them, keeping her eyes trained to the worn wood floor. She heard a few snickers, saw a couple hands point her out from their shadowy seats. Even as the large frames filled her periphery, she walked steadfastly towards the counter at the far end of the room. Everyone in the room recognized immediately how out of place she was. While they were each bedecked in their protective charms and talismans, some hanging from their necks, others etched into the scar tissue of their bodies. All she had was the flimsy barrier of her coat, still pulled tight around her against the now suffocating heat of the small room. She walked gingerly across the creaking floorboards, barely daring to breathe. They grinned and watched. Marjorie approached the counter and lifted her eyes to see the attendant slouched on a stool behind the domed glass structure. Halfway to his face, her eyes froze on the contents of the display case. She assumed the rotted lumps inside had once been some sort of meat, though they were now covered in flies and maggots. Pooled, congealed blood covered the bottom surface, even seeping out and down to the floor. She followed the trail to see the red-stained, warped wood along the floorboards. Mouth agape and eyes wide, she was certain she saw a few eyeballs and fingers mixed in amongst the decay, but she tried to put it out of her mind. "Want to try a sample?" came the mocking, gravelly voice of the attendant as he pulled open the door to the case. Immediately, a wave of putrescence poured out and enveloped Marjorie. She did her best to escape it, stumbling backwards and tripping over a warped floorboard. There was a low chuckle from those gathered around her, growing more and more quickly into a round of bawdy laughter. was the sound of a lock snapping into place as the attendant continued to laugh. She studied him briefly from her place on the floor behind watery eyes. He was filthy, covered in a layer of grime that made it impossible to tell his age. A tangled mess of dirt and wispy hair sat atop his head, falling into his beady eyes as he rocked back and forth with laughter at her predicament. His hands, stained and caked with muck, gripped the counter as long yellowed nails scraped across the glass in time to his chuckling. Marjorie did her best to pull herself together, rising from the floor and straightening her clothes, as if that would restore her dignity. The smell had faded, now only a slight whiff of decay rather than the malodorous assault. That or her nose could no longer register the scent, having burned out that sense for good. She threw her head back, eyes meeting the dark, glassy eyes of the man behind the counter. "I'm here to speak with the owner," she said in what she hoped was a confident voice. It did not help that it trembled and broke as she spoke, but at her words, a begrudging silence spread through the room. The attendant snorted, a thick, mucusy sound. For a moment, she was afraid he was preparing to spit on her. Instead, he jerked one dirty finger to a paper ticket dispenser. "Take a number, then." With that, the attention on her seemed to fade. The low grumble of conversation returned, and she heard chairs scraping across the wood as the denizens returned to their intrigue. She walked over and gripped the dusty piece of paper delicately, as if afraid it might crumble to dust in her fingers. Perhaps this was another trick. Instead, the machine groaned and dispensed with a tiny slip. "Number 43. She looked around for some sign that told her where she was. She had not seen anyone enter or leave today, so perhaps the line was long, but there was no such indicator. "Excuse me," she cautiously questioned the attendant. "How do I know what number is up?" One eye turned to face her, the other stared out over the bar. "Take a seat and you'll be called." His eye flicked back to whatever it was between the counter and door that so rapidly held his attention. Marjorie gingerly picked her way over to an unoccupied table, acutely aware that her back was exposed to whatever kind of people like to congregate in a place like this. She was certain that she could feel each individual eye raking over her back, sense spider-like appendages trace up and down her spine. Her hands were balled into knots, was a small tree that grew just outside that always seemed to be absolutely covered in new leaves that shone with that bright spring green. That was the color of the eye, and it shone and sparkled like sunlight reflecting off water. There now, I'm sure we can work something out. I just know I can help you with whatever you need. Lucy's voice was a soft sing-song, not the harsh growl of a dedicated chain smoker like before. I even make sure my prices are fair, especially for a very young thing like yourself. Marjorie felt a hand on her knee, gently stroking. Them pretty eyes of yours, they look like they've seen a world of heartache, eh? I could take care of those for you. You'd like that, yes? Eye fixated, Marjorie felt her head begin to bob slightly. To not see the horrors she had in her time, well, that would be nice. I see you like the idea. Lucy's face cracked open into a wide grin. I thought you might. I'm good at seeing what people really need from me. I just need you to say it. Say you'll give me those awful eyes of yours, and I'll make sure you never have to see something so terrible again. Marjorie's mouth opened, the very words on her lips, when a strong hand settled onto her shoulder. It smelled of leather and blood and gripped her shoulder hard enough to break the trance. Not going to let you have all the fun, old Luce. It's not every day we get something so lovely in this dingy place. Marjorie felt dizzy and confused, as if time were moving at double again its normal pace. Her mind was slow in catching up to what was happening, what had almost happened, leaving her feeling as if she were lagging behind the rest of the world. Now Lucy was standing, measuring up to a formidable height, with anger in that lone green eye. I'll not have you meddling, Thomas. She and I were nearly to a deal. A deal you tricked her into, no less. Where's the fun in that? Just weave your little spell and she'll say whatever you want. You've gone soft, Luce. I need to make you work for it. His voice was soft, but firm. It seemed to cut through the background din like a razor, until it was the only thing she could hear. As Marjorie's mind caught up with what had just nearly happened, she felt her heart begin to race. And then there was the hand on her shoulder, the firm grip beginning to hurt with its intensity. The man bent over her shoulder, smiling. A long black beard tickled against the skin of her neck, and she could smell the whiskey on his breath. I'm afraid we have not been introduced, and I've already gone and saved your life. It's a bad habit, I admit. My name is Thomas. He extended his other hand towards her, the one on her shoulder growing tighter as she refused to shake. Oh, we must be polite in an uncivil place as this, yes? What's your name? Marjorie whimpered at the pain in her shoulder, but fixed her eyes back on the table. She had to talk to the owner. She had to make her request. Back off and let her be, Thomas. saw a slender man standing to the side. He stood just within her periphery, far enough back that she could only make out the vague shape of him. Thomas, do be careful. There is plenty of her to go around if we just act with a little tact. I bet you could make some even better deals if you thought this through. Oh no, you aren't going to trip me up with that again. You swindled me out of everything last time. You're right, it was a bit of a dirty trick, but surely you and Luce could work out some sort of a deal. You don't need her eyes after all. Marjorie noticed the shadow of Luce appeared to turn and nod towards the man up to the side, and she heard a very soft chuckle from him. Thomas's hands gripped her hair even more tightly. You're just mad that I got to her first, and this time I'm cutting you out. Well, fine, but I fear it's not just me you'll be fighting against, Tom. A lot of us would like a piece of her. Thomas leaned back down by her ear, his words coming in a whispered frenzy. Well, dear, looks like they'll be taking you piece by piece. What do you say then? Give old Thomas whatever years you've got left. At least they'll go to some sort of use, yeah? Marjorie heard grumbling in the room, the sound of chairs scraping along the wood, and a chorus of various metals meeting metal. There was a new tension in the uncomfortably warm room, a weight that pressed down all around her. Come on, time's ticking. Do we have a deal? You look like an altruistic soul. Help me out. Footsteps coming close, a few short barks of anger. The intensity increased in his voice and he shook her head sharply. They'll cut out your tongue soon, so you best tell me now. Marjorie felt tears falling down her cheeks, a steady stream now pouring from her eyes. She had to speak to the owner. She had to make her request. Only she was not so sure she'd even get that chance. Someone grabbed Thomas and the knife nicked her, drawing a thin line of blood far less lethal than it could have been. Marjorie dove under the table, trying to evade the arms that grabbed at her. There was the smell of blood in the room, and all the inhabitants had been suitably whipped into a frenzy. She was the lone fish drifting amongst the sharks, rough stuff. She nodded mutely, uncertain now of how to proceed. He simply smiled at her and gave her the time she needed to study him. His teeth were bright white, the only clean thing she had seen since entering the deli. His eyes were as dark as his teeth were white, but they appeared to be friendly. As he waited for her to speak, he knitted his fingers together in front of him, rolling his shoulder to straighten out the drape of his crisp suit coat. Every bit of him seemed to be polished and neat, a stark contrast to the room before. "Are you the devil?" she finally managed to squeak out, eyes wide. He laughed, throwing his head back and letting the sound ripple around the room. It was a friendly, amused sound that put her at ease. "Oh no, nothing so boring as that. But you can give people whatever they want." He composed himself, that same broad smile still on his face. "Well, of course I can, but there is much more to this world than your simple understanding of gods and devils. Don't worry, Marjorie, this is no deal with the devil. But do tell me, what is it you want?" I came here to..." The words would not come. She had thought and thought about how she would tell her story, how she would describe the years of abuse, threats, and evil. She considered taking off her coat and showing him the pale yellow stains of old bruises, but they were now marred by fresh ones from the fray. She felt for the death certificate in her pocket, the name of her first son written on it, and now the words would not come. He watched patiently, no hint of irritation at her pause. When she began to sob, he offered her the handkerchief from his front pocket. "He told everyone I was drunk. That was how I fell down the stairs. That was why Mikey died." The tears were coming more in earnest now, and she dabbed at her eyes with the handkerchief. "They all looked at me like a terrible mother, that I would be drinking while pregnant. They blamed me. If I had been sober, I wouldn't have fallen and Mikey would have at least had a chance. No one believed me." "I don't bring people back from the dead, Marjorie. Even I don't meddle in things like that." His voice was soft, almost as if moved by her tearful story. She took that moment to compose herself, sniffling and wiping away the tears. "I know. That's not why I'm here. I want you to kill my husband." The words were out, blunt and dirty, before she realized what she was saying. This was not how the discussion was supposed to have gone. His face brightened. "Oh, is that all you need? Well, that should be a relatively easy matter. You don't understand. He's a monster. It won't be easy to kill him, but you have to. You have to kill him, because he's a very bad person. Marjorie, I don't care who he is. He could be Hitler or the Pope reincarnate. All I care about is that you want him dead, and I can make that happen, no matter how monstrous he might be." He reached over and pulled an ornate ink pen from his desk. "I will need some details, like his name, address, distinguishing physical features. Also, would you like proof of death?" Marjorie's stomach churned at the thought of what she was doing. It was the only way, though. He had to pay for his crimes, and no one else was willing to do it. "No, I won't need that. Everyone says you follow through on your deals." Word of mouth is certainly best advertisement for services such as mine. He smiled that disarming smile again. Well, his name is David Bergen, and his address is 1394 Windhaven Road, apartment 1722. It's in Topeka. He continued writing and nodding. He's about 6 foot tall, a big, bulky guy, blonde hair, brown eyes. He has some sort of tribal tattoo on the back of his neck, one of a skull on his right bicep. Is that enough? Oh, that's lovely. A wonderful description. I'll dispatch someone right away, he said, nodding to the small girl. Marjorie heard the door swing open behind her, then close quietly. But now that your terms are set, let us discuss what I shall get in return. A few rules. I don't trade in souls. It is simply too much of a hassle to deal with, and the return is rather poor. I also don't accept firstborn children. At this, he nodded his head towards the spot the girl had been the moment before. I've done it once, but I've found children are not particularly useful. There was a sudden cruel glint to his smile. Besides, someone has already taken yours. Marjorie was silent, her fingers worrying over the hem of her jacket, as if that would provide some solace in this moment. Her heart was pounding again, and she wondered if perhaps she was going to suffocate here in this office. The scents and furnishing that had seemed so lavish now felt oppressive. But I can give you anything else, right? He paused to consider her comments. I reserve the right to refuse any substandard trade. I won't, for instance, take your pocket lint. He chuckled appreciatively at his own joke. But I accept most fair trades. His demeanor turned more serious, perhaps even taking on a sinister air. He leaned forward over the desk, shadows growing across his face as he did so. Think carefully now about what you'll give me for this. Whatever you decide, you will think it is something you would never want back no matter how long you live. But once it's gone, you'll find you cannot live without it. You'll yearn for it. You'll do anything to replace it. You'll take it, but it will never be enough. Will always be shrouded in the filth of something agonizing pain did not remove fear. I can take away others' pain now, right? His eyes simmered with glee, as if her altruism was a delicious appetizer. Of course, my dear, and you most certainly will. Again and again, you'll valiantly step in and take every ache from their bodies, dry the tears from